Welcome to Westminster Presbyterian Seminary's series of podcasts on church history. In our previous podcast, we noted that John Calvin undertook the writing of the Institutes, initially to provide, as he puts it, some elementary teaching for his fellow countrymen, Frenchmen and Frenchwomen, whom he says were hungering and thirsting after Christ. Part of the purpose of the Institutes was to make clear to non-evangelicals, whether Roman Catholics or Renaissance humanists, where the Reformation stood doctrinally. There were ridiculous ideas identifying the reformers with ancient heresies, with extreme anarchic Anabaptists, and with moral permissiveness. Calvin therefore wrote the Institutes as a confession of faith of evangelicals, showing their orthodoxy to the classic creeds of the church, their loyalty to political order, and their acceptance of the moral demands of God's law. There should be no need after this for anyone who could understand Latin to plead ignorance of the Reformation faith. Because of the precariousness of his own personal situation, with his brother and sister and one or two friends, Calvin set off for the free city of Strasbourg, where under Martin Bucer the Reformation had established itself in quite a striking and remarkable way. Because of the exigencies of the time, Calvin could not take a direct route to Strasbourg, and he had therefore to approach Strasbourg from the south. And when he and his small party arrived in Geneva, which had recently declared itself for the Reformation, they put up for the night, intending to resume their journey in the morning. But before the evening was out, it had come to the notice of the leader of the Reformation in Geneva, William Farel, that the author of the Institutes was in the city. Calvin's fame was beginning to be known. Farel was very conscious of his limitations. He knew that if the Reformation was to succeed in Geneva, he needed someone with greater ability than himself. And it seemed to him that God had provided him in John Calvin that greater ability. Calvin pleaded with him to stay and help the cause of Reformation in Geneva, but Calvin was adamant that he was a poor, timid scholar, as he put it, and that his heart was set on going to Strasbourg. Farel was baffled, frustrated, and he cursed Calvin. Or I should say, he said that God would curse Calvin unless Calvin laid aside his own interests and gave himself to the cause of God in Geneva. Calvin later wrote, "I felt as if God from heaven had laid his mighty hand on me to stop me in my course, and I was so terror-stricken that I did not continue on my journey." Through all that followed, Calvin never doubted that God had called him into gospel ministry. In 1538, Calvin was dismissed with Farel from the church in Geneva, from the city of Geneva. Calvin desired the city to be shaped and styled wholly by the Word of God, and for the church to have responsibility for its discipline. That was a step too far for the city council to stomach. And so Calvin departed after barely 18 months. And for the next 3 years, Calvin rejoiced in being in Strasbourg. Those 3 years in Strasbourg were remarkably fruitful for Calvin. He came under the influence of Martin Bucer, whose influence was striking for Calvin in a number of ways, not least in his understanding of the doctrine of the church. With Bucer at the helm, Calvin was given the provision of pastoring a French refugee congregation in Strasbourg. And it was there that Calvin met Idelette de Boer, the widow of an Anabaptist. Both of them had come to saving faith through Calvin's ministry, and Calvin married her. Some scholars say Calvin was somewhat cool about the whole thought of marriage. That, I think, is to wholly misunderstand Calvin. He was who he was, but when Idelette died, Calvin was broken-hearted, absolutely broken-hearted. In 1541, Geneva pleaded with Calvin to return. The cause of Reformation was in turmoil. 2 years before, the Roman Church had sent Cardinal Sadoleto to Geneva to plead with the Genevans to return to the Roman fold. He had written a very erudite, somewhat compelling treatise pleading with the Genevans to return to Mother Church. Remarkably, the Genevans turned to Calvin to answer Sadoleto, and Calvin's answer to Sadoleto is one of the great documents of the Protestant Reformation. Calvin returned to Geneva. At first he was deeply reluctant to do so. I would rather die 100 deaths than go back to that hellhole, he wrote. So why did he return? Well, because he was not his own. He was Deus subjugat, a man subdued by God. It was not for him to determine and decide where he should serve the Lord. And with the encouragement of his closest friends and with a deep sense of the call of God, Calvin returned to Geneva. Strikingly, the first sermon he preached, and we're not quite sure actually what the sermon was, there's a number of suggestions, but what we do know is that Calvin simply picked up the text that followed on from the text he preached just prior to his dismissal. Calvin's great concern when he returned to Geneva was to reorganize the church and shape it by the teaching of the Word of God. In the New Testament, he found 4 permanent orders of ministry, and it's around these 4 orders that he constructed his organisation. He prepared a draft document, the Ecclesiastical Ordinances. In this 4-fold ministry, the whole life of the church was to be covered. Its worship, its education, its soundness, its purity, its works of mercy and of love. To the pastors was committed the ministry of the word and the sacraments. They conducted the services, preached and administered the sacraments, and generally cared for the spiritual welfare of the parishioners. In each of the 3 parish churches, 2 services were held on Sundays and a catechism class for children. During the week, a service was held every other day, and later on, every day. The Lord's Supper was to be celebrated quarterly, not once a week, as Calvin himself wished. The doctors or teachers had the responsibility for education, both for adults and children. There were lectures on the Old and New Testaments, usually held on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. These were more academic than the sermons and were mostly conducted in Latin. The education of children was also to be provided for. But here there were great difficulties owing to the scarcity of suitable teachers and a lack of money. Eventually the problem was overcome with the establishment of the Genevan Academy in 1559. The 3rd order was that of elders. In every district of the city there were 1 or 2 elders who would keep an eye on spiritual affairs. If they saw, for example, that so-and-so was frequently the worse for drink, or that someone was beating up their wife, or whatever it may be, they were to admonish them in a brotherly spirit. And only if they refused to submit, would they be brought before the consistory and perhaps ultimately before the council. And finally, the social welfare work was the charge of the deacons. They were the hospital management board, if you like, the social security executives. And it was the proud boast that there were no beggars in Geneva. So Calvin is returned to Geneva. From 1541 to 1555, there was an anti-Calvin majority on the city council. And it's only in the last 9 years of his life, to 1564, that Calvin actually begins to enjoy some measure of peace during his ministry as the primus inter pares amongst the pastors of Geneva. And in our third podcast, we will continue to examine Calvin's continuing ministry and subsequent achievements.